1944, it was the summer of 1944, and the war had turned against Germany. The Allies were gaining ground in France, and the skies above Europe were no longer ruled by the Luftwaffe. In secret airfields far from the front, German engineers and test pilots were still working, hoping to find something, anything that could turn the tide. One hot morning, a flatbed truck rolled into a guarded airbase just outside of Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main test center. On the truck sat something unusual, an American P-51 Mustang, nearly untouched, painted in silver with faded U.S. markings. Its nose had been repainted with the black cross of the Luftwaffe, but anyone with eyes could tell. It was not German. This Mustang had been captured weeks earlier, forced to land after engine trouble over occupied territory. Instead of destroying the plane, the Americans had been unlucky. Now the Germans had one of the Allies' best fighters in their hands. The news spread quickly among the Luftwaffe staff. Test pilots whispered about the Mustang in the hangar. Some were excited, others skeptical. How good could it really be? The pilot chosen to fly the Mustang was Hauptmann Erich Kessler, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled test pilots. He had flown nearly everything Germany had to offer, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even the new jet-powered Me-262. But now he would sit inside the cockpit of the enemy's pride. As he walked toward the aircraft, a small group of engineers and mechanics watched in silence. The Mustang stood sleek and sharp, its canopy gleaming under the morning sun. Erich climbed into the cockpit, adjusting his seat and running his fingers along the unfamiliar instruments. Some of them had been relabeled in German, but many were still marked in English. He smiled to himself. So this is what the Americans are flying. With a quick nod from the ground crew, the engine roared to life. The Merlin engine, British-designed and American-built, growled smoothly. It was different from the rougher sounds of German engines, more controlled, almost elegant. The plane rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky with ease. Erich climbed higher, testing its controls. It responded quickly, sharply, more like a sports car than a warplane. At 10,000 feet, he pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang surged ahead, smooth and fast. Back on the ground, the others waited nervously. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, the black cross-marked Mustang returned, its wheels kissing the runway before rolling to a stop. Erich climbed down slowly, removing his helmet. His face was blank for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "This thing is perfect," he said. A silence followed. One of the engineers asked, "Is it better than the FW-190? Erich didn't hesitate. "Yes, faster than the Bf-109. He looked at them, eyes serious. "At full speed, I reached 444 miles per hour. None of our planes can match that. Not at altitude, not in level flight." The words hit hard. The Luftwaffe had always prided itself on its machines, but this American plane had exposed a truth many didn't want to admit. For the next several days, other test pilots flew the Mustang. Each returned with similar praise. It climbed fast, turned smoothly, handled like a dream. Even at high altitudes, it kept its power. That was something German planes struggled with, especially against the new Allied bombers flying deep into the Reich. Soon, reports were sent to the High Command. Some generals refused to believe them. Others panicked. One report simply said, "If the Americans have this plane in large numbers, we will not win the war in the air." But there was little Germany could do. Their factories were being bombed. Their fuel was running low. Time was not on their side, and now they knew there was a machine flying above Europe that they could not beat. Not with skill, not with speed, not with anything they had left. The report on the captured Mustang caused quiet chaos within certain Luftwaffe circles. Behind closed doors, officers debated. Engineers frowned over blueprints. Some called it Allied propaganda, even though the evidence stood in their own hangar, still wearing the Luftwaffe cross like a borrowed uniform. The truth was too uncomfortable for many to admit. The Allies had outbuilt them, outthought them, outflew them, but not everyone was ready to accept defeat. Hauptmann Erich Kessler, still shaken by the Mustang's performance, found himself summoned to Berlin, an urgent meeting at the Ministry of Aviation. When he arrived, he was met by Oberst Walter Thiemann, a sharp-eyed officer with a cruel smile who never flew a single combat mission but had influence in the highest ranks. "You flew the American plane?" Thiemann asked, pacing slowly. "Yes, sir, and it reached 444 Peak." Eric nodded. "Yes, I confirmed it myself. Clean, stable, powerful even at high altitude." Thiemann narrowed his eyes. "So, you're telling me an enemy machine is better than our finest engineering?" "I'm telling you the truth," Eric said calmly. Thiemann scoffed. "That's not the answer we were hoping for." Eric kept his face still. "It's the only answer that matters, sir." Silence stretched for a moment. Then Thiemann leaned in. "Then you will write a full report," he said coldly. "And you will downplay everything. Speed, handling, combat value. Understood?" "No," Eric replied. Thiemann's jaw tightened. "You're refusing a direct order." "I'm refusing to lie." That night, Eric didn't sleep much. He knew what defiance meant. The Gestapo didn't need reasons. Men disappeared for less. But he couldn't bring himself to pretend the Mustang was anything less than remarkable. It wasn't just better, it was frighteningly better. And every day, more of them crossed the skies of Germany. Back at Rechlin, whispers of punishment reached the hangars. Pilots spoke quietly about Eric's refusal. Some called him a fool. Others called him brave. But all of them kept looking at the Mustang. It had become a symbol of what they were really up against. Not just a plane, but a future they couldn't catch. To make matters worse, the fuel crisis had begun choking their operations. The new jet-powered Me-262s, once seen as Germany's miracle weapon, sat on runways with empty tanks. Meanwhile, American P-51s escorted bombers deep into the Reich, destroying railways, oil plants, and airfields. One afternoon, Erich was approached by another test pilot, a younger man named Dieter Braun. "I've been assigned to fly the Mustang next," Dieter said nervously. "Any advice?" Eric looked at the plane, then back at the young pilot. "Don't fight it. Let it guide you. It flies like it wants to survive." Dieter smiled, thinking it was a joke. But once he landed, he didn't laugh. He walked straight to the engineers and said, "That thing turns like it's reading my mind. It climbs like it wants to leave the war behind." The men around him nodded in quiet agreement. None of them had flown anything quite like it. In the following days, one engineer suggested they should try to copy the design. Perhaps they could build a German version of the Mustang, but it was a fantasy. The tooling, the engine, the materials, it was all beyond reach now. Germany had no time, no resources, and worst of all, no air superiority. Even if they built one, the skies were no longer safe for prototypes. As the war dragged on and the Allies pushed closer to Berlin, the Mustang became more than just a machine. It became a warning, a message written in the roar of its engine. "You are outmatched." Erich flew it one last time before the order came to dismantle it. Some feared it might fall into the hands of partisans or be captured again by the Allies. The Luftwaffe, embarrassed, wanted to erase the evidence of their failure, but as the propeller wound down for the final time, Erich placed his hand gently on the Mustang's silver fuselage. "You were never our enemy," he whispered. "Just better than anything we dared to dream." 1945. Snow had begun to fall across the airfield at Rechlin, turning the runways white and quiet. The Mustang, now stripped of its markings, sat under a canvas tarp near the edge of the hangar, half forgotten and unspoken, like a secret everyone knew, but no one dared mention anymore. The war was in its final stage. Cities were burning, and the skies above Germany were filled with the steady drone of Allied bombers, escorted as always by squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, flying in elegant, terrifying formations. They were no longer rare sights. They were constant, inevitable. Inside a small, cold office, Erich sat with a cigarette between his fingers, eyes fixed on the file before him. It was marked Verschlusssache, confidential. The contents were orders. All non-essential aircraft to be destroyed before Allied troops reached central Germany. The Mustang was on that list. Dieter Braun walked in, cheeks red from the cold. "They want us to burn it," he said, pulling off his gloves. "I know," Erich muttered. "They're afraid it'll end up in Allied hands." No, Eric said slowly. They're afraid it'll make us look weak, like we admired it too much. Dieter leaned against the wall. It's the best plane I've ever flown. I know, Eric repeated, his voice low. They both knew the truth. The Mustang wasn't just better on paper. It was better where it mattered, in the sky, in battle, where real pilots bled and died. It had balance, power, range, and worst of all, it was being produced in numbers Germany could never match. Erich stood up, walked to the window, and watched as another formation of German aircraft struggled into the air for a patrol. Their engines coughed black smoke into the freezing sky. He wondered how many would come back. That night, under cover of darkness, Erich and Dieter went to the hangar. The Mustang sat there silent, like it was waiting for them. They pulled back the top. Its silver skin caught the moonlight, and for a moment they both just stared. Let's take it up one more time, Dieter whispered. Erich shook his head. Too risky. The Allies shoot anything now, no questions. Dieter gave a small grin. Then let's fly it low. Just once, north, away from the front. Erich hesitated. He knew what it meant. Disobeying orders. Stealing a plane that technically didn't belong to them. But it was the only bird left on that airfield worth flying. Everything else was dying on the ground. He'd looked at the Mustang, then at Dieter. Fuel? I've hidden enough to get us 50 kilometers. Maybe more. Erich laughed under his breath. You planned this? I hoped. An hour later, the Mustang roared back to life. The engine had sat still for weeks, but it responded like it was born to fly. They didn't need lights. They didn't need permission. The wheels lifted off the frozen ground, and the Mustang soared into the night sky, low, fast, beautiful. They followed the river north, flying beneath radar, beneath expectation. Villages passed below them like shadows. They weren't escaping. They weren't defecting. They just needed one more flight. One more moment where flying meant freedom, not war. 20 minutes in, they saw the flicker of lights on the horizon. British trucks, columns of soldiers moving through the countryside. Erich banked hard, staying in the shadows. They weren't going to be shot down tonight, not by friend or foe. The fuel gauge dipped lower. We should turn back, Dieter said into the headset. We can't, Erich replied. If we land it there, they'll burn it. This thing deserves better. Dieter was quiet for a while. Then he said, so what do we do? Erich adjusted the throttle. We land it in the forest, somewhere quiet, and leave it. Let the Americans find it. Let them know we respected it. It was madness, but it was honest. They found a frozen clearing just beyond a tree line near an abandoned farm. The Mustang skidded through snow, wings level, then slowed to a stop in a shallow ditch. Silence fell again, just the ticking of the engine cooling under a starlit sky. Erich climbed down first, boots crunching in snow. Dieter followed, carrying a small can of black paint. On the tail, beneath the old Luftwaffe cross, they wrote in neat English letters, flown, admired, respected, Luftwaffe Testpiloten. 1945. They left it there, untouched. Its engine still warm. 45 by dawn, Erich and Dieter had made their way through the frostbitten countryside, heading east toward the small town of Lübz. Their stolen flight in the Mustang was behind them now, a reckless act of defiance and admiration wrapped into one. They didn't speak much as they walked, but both carried the same feeling in their chest. Something strange, not quite guilt, not quite pride. It was the kind of silence only real pilots understood, the kind that comes after flying something unforgettable. They knew they couldn't go back to Rechlin. That base, like many others, would soon be swallowed up by either Allied or Soviet forces. Erich suspected orders had already been given for his arrest. Dieter had laughed at the thought, calling it worth it. But even that laughter had started to fade. As they reached a railway line just outside Lübz, they saw smoke in the distance, not from battle, but from a derailed train. Nearby lay scattered crates marked with Luftwaffe insignia. Ammo, parts, fuel cans, all useless now. German soldiers were retreating from everywhere. The war machine was eating itself from the inside. We're done, Dieter muttered, kicking a frozen clump of dirt. The whole damn thing is falling apart. Erich didn't answer. He was looking toward the eastern sky. It was darker there, not because of clouds, but because of what was coming. The Soviets. They'd heard stories, villages burned, civilians slaughtered, no mercy for anyone in uniform. The Americans might put you in a camp and give you cigarettes. The Russians. You were lucky if they just shot you. We head west, Eric finally said. Try to reach American lines. It was a gamble, but staying was a death sentence. They traded their flight suits for civilian clothes stolen from an abandoned farmhouse. Eric shaved. Dieter found a long coat and buried his dog tags under the snow. From now on, they were no longer Luftwaffe pilots. They were nobodies, just like millions of others walking through the ruins of a dying Reich. 3 days passed. They slept in barns, stole bread from cellars, and kept to side roads. Now and then, they heard Mustangs overhead, the distinct roar of their engines cutting through the silence. Erich would stop every time, tilt his head upward and listen, not out of fear, out of respect. They own the sky, he said once. On the 4th day, they reached a town that had already been taken by the Americans. White flags hung from windows. GI trucks rolled through the streets. The war wasn't over, but here it felt paused, controlled. Eric and Dieter approached a checkpoint cautiously, hands raised. The American soldiers looked young, tired, but alert. You Wehrmacht? One of them barked. No, Eric replied in broken English. Pilots, Luftwaffe, no longer fighting. They were searched, questioned, and finally escorted to a makeshift camp. Inside, they found dozens of German soldiers, some Wehrmacht, some SS, some Luftwaffe, all waiting to be processed. That night, while sitting beside a campfire, Eric overheard 2 American mechanics talking nearby. They were discussing a strange plane found hidden in a forest. Silver, P-51, tail painted with German words. A captured bird, maybe, one said. Command thinks it's a message. Says the Germans were studying it. The Krauts respected it, the other added. Hell, maybe they knew they'd lost just by flying it. Eric smiled quietly in the dark. He leaned back against the wall of the tent, listening to the wind outside. Dieter nudged him. They found it. Eric nodded. Good. In the days that followed, Allied intelligence would inspect the aircraft. Photographs were taken. The note on the tail was translated. A copy of it was passed all the way up to General Eisenhower himself. Flown, admired, respected. It was strange, almost poetic. In a war soaked with hatred and cruelty, a single gesture of honesty had risen above the noise. Not because it changed anything, but because it proved something. Even in war, men could still recognize greatness, even if it came from the other side. 1945. In the prison camp near Aachen, life moved in slow circles. Eric and Dieter had been processed, tagged as Luftwaffe personnel, and placed in a fenced compound with hundreds of other German soldiers. They were lucky, in a way. The Americans fed them, didn't ask too many questions, and treated them better than they expected. But freedom still felt a world away. Each morning, Eric would wake to the hum of aircraft engines in the distance, always Mustangs or Thunderbolts roaring across the sky in perfect formation. Even in captivity, the sound stirred something inside him. Not fear, not regret, just a strange ache. Like something he had once loved was now part of someone else's world. One afternoon, while standing in line for bread, an American officer approached the fence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a clipboard tucked under his arm and a hard look in his eyes. "Erich Kessler?" he asked. Eric stiffened. "Yes." "You flew the Mustang." Dieter, standing behind him, tensed. Eric simply nodded. "I did." The officer signaled to the guards. "Come with me." They led Eric to a separate tent, far from the main compound. Inside, the air was warmer, and 2 men in civilian suits sat at a folding table. One of them stood as Eric entered and extended his hand. Captain Thomas Weaver, Allied Intelligence. Eric shook his hand warily. The other man lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. "You left us a message." Eric said nothing. Captain Weaver opened a file. Inside were photographs of the Mustang, his Mustang, just as they had left it in the forest. The words painted on the tail were clearly visible. We found it exactly where you said, Weaver continued. Intact, barely scratched. The message was clear. Eric waited, unsure where this was going. Why did you do it? The second man asked, exhaling smoke. Eric paused before answering. Because it deserved to be remembered, not burned in a pile with the rest of our lies. The second man raised an eyebrow. You mean Nazi propaganda? I mean everything we were told about being the best, Eric replied quietly. That our planes ruled the skies, that we were untouchable. We weren't. That machine proved it. Captain Weaver studied him for a long moment. You're not like most of the others. I'm tired of pretending. There was a silence after that, a thick one. Then Weaver slid a paper across the table. We want to ask you a few technical questions about how the Luftwaffe tested aircraft, what you flew, how you trained, nothing about combat, just design performance procedures. Eric hesitated. You want me to talk about our weaknesses? No, Weaver said. We already beat you. We just want to know how close you got. Eric looked at the paper. There were lines to sign, disclaimers in English and German, cooperation in exchange for better treatment. Nothing dramatic, just fewer guards, warmer food, maybe a smaller cell. I'll answer what I can, he said finally. Good, Weaver replied, because your report from Rechlin about the Mustang's performance, we found a copy in a destroyed Luftwaffe archive. It matches everything we suspected. Eric blinked. You already had it? We did, but the truth hits harder when it comes from the mouth of the man who flew it. For the next hour, Eric answered questions about flight tests, engine comparisons, altitude performance, training programs. He held nothing back, not out of loyalty to the Americans, but because his loyalty to the Reich had died somewhere above 25,000 feet, the first time the Mustang outclimbed his Messerschmitt. When he was escorted back to the camp, Dieter was waiting. What happened? They knew everything, Eric said. They just wanted to hear it from me. And did you tell them? I did. Dieter sighed. You think we'll be punished? No, Eric said. I think we'll be forgotten. That night, lying on his cot beneath a torn wool blanket, Eric stared at the roof of the tent. He thought of the war, the lies they were fed, the machines they worshipped, and the one plane that broke all of it wide open. Not with bullets, but with truth. The Mustang didn't just beat them in the sky, it beat their pride, and somehow that was worse. 45. Weeks passed, and spring began to thaw the last grip of winter. The war in Europe was all but over now. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Across the camp, rumors spread like wildfire. Germany had surrendered, unconditional, final. For the prisoners, the news was met with a strange silence. No one cheered, no one cried. Most just stared blankly, shoulders slumped, the weight of 5 years finally crashing down on their backs. The Reich they had fought for had vanished overnight, and in its place, nothing, no nation, no future, just the long, slow wait for someone to decide what happened to them next. Eric sat on a wooden bench near the perimeter fence, whittling, a piece of scrap wood with a dull knife someone had smuggled in. His hands moved slowly, not for art, but for habit. He hadn't touched a cockpit in months, and now the ache to fly had turned into something quieter, sadder. Dieter sat beside him, holding a folded scrap of paper. A drawing, childish, rough, of the Mustang they'd flown. He had sketched it from memory, over and over, until the pencil had worn down to a stub. You know what I keep thinking about? Dieter asked, not looking up. Eric kept carving. That sound the Merlin engine made. It wasn't like ours. It had rhythm, like a growl and a hum mixed together. Eric smiled faintly. You still dreaming about it? Every damn night. They both laughed quietly, but it was hollow, like the laughter of men who knew they'd lived their last real moment long ago. That afternoon, something unusual happened. Two American officers arrived in a jeep, both wearing crisp uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. They spoke briefly with the guards and then pointed directly toward Eric and Dieter. "Looks like you've got fans," Dieter muttered. The officers approached. "Kessler, Braun," the taller one said, "come with us." Neither resisted. They were led beyond the fence, across the field, and into a small barracks-turned office. A familiar face waited inside. Captain Thomas Weaver. He stood and offered them coffee, strong, black, bitter. "We have a proposal," he said without preamble. Eric and Dieter exchanged glances. Weaver continued, pulling out a folder. "The United States is beginning a post-war project. We're calling it Operation Lusty. We're collecting advanced German aircraft, jet technology, blueprints, even personnel, test pilots, engineers, scientists. You two are among the few who've flown both German and Allied designs." "And?" Eric asked cautiously. "We want your help," Weaver said. "We've recovered the Mustang you flew. It's being shipped to the States for testing. We want you there to explain what you observed, what you felt, and how it compared to everything Germany built." Dieter laughed in disbelief. "You want us to go to America? As what? Prisoners?" "No," Weaver said. "As consultants." Eric narrowed his eyes. "Why us?" "Because," Weaver said, leaning forward, "you didn't lie. You flew that plane and told the truth, even when it embarrassed your own side. That means something." There was a long silence. Eric stared at the folder. His fingers twitched like they remembered controls that no longer existed. In his chest, something stirred again, quietly, carefully. The idea of flying, of being near machines that mattered, of no longer being stuck behind fences. "And if we say no," Dieter asked, "then you stay here," Weaver said flatly. "Months, maybe years, until someone else decides what to do with you." Eric didn't speak for a full minute. Then he reached out and closed the folder. "I'll go," he said. Dieter exhaled. "So will I." Weaver smiled. "Good, you leave in 2 days. Keep quiet about it. You'll be listed as transferred. Officially, you'll disappear." As they walked back to the barracks, Dieter grinned. "Think they'll let us fly again?" Eric looked up at the sky. A lone Mustang passed high overhead, silver wings catching the late afternoon sun. "They'd be fools not to," he said. And for the first time in months, he meant it. 1945. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the ocean stretched endlessly below, a deep grey blue broken only by waves and cloud shadows. Inside the belly of a C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft, Eric Kessler and Dieter Braun sat strapped into narrow canvas seats, surrounded by boxes marked "Top Secret U.S. Army Air Forces." The roar of the engines was constant, drowning out most conversation unless you leaned in close. Neither of them had spoken much since takeoff. The weight of what they were doing, what they had agreed to, hadn't fully settled in. They weren't prisoners anymore, not exactly, but they weren't free men either. Just two former enemy pilots being flown across the world to help the very nation they once fought against. "I still can't believe this," Dieter finally muttered, trying to get comfortable. "Believe it," Eric said, "because this is the future now." Dieter looked at him. "Do you really trust them?" Eric thought about it, then nodded. "More than I ever trusted the people we used to work for." The next morning, they landed at Wright Field, Ohio, a major testing site for the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was massive, clean, and buzzing with activity. Hangars lined the runways like massive silver boxes. Engineers, officers, and mechanics swarmed the tarmac. Everything ran on schedule. Everything had a purpose. No rubble. No fear, no desperation. Eric immediately noticed the difference. Germany had still been fighting a war with scraps. This place, it was already building for the next one. They were greeted by two men in civilian suits, both sharp, polite, and clearly intelligent. "Gentlemen," one said, "welcome to Operation Lusty. Inside a private hangar covered with a thick green tarp sat the Mustang. Their Mustang. The one they had flown across Germany, hidden in a forest, and marked with their final message. It had been carefully disassembled, shipped piece by piece across the Atlantic, and was now being studied by American engineers like a sacred relic. When the tarp was pulled off, Erich actually gasped. It looked perfect. The paint was still faded. The tail still bore their message in black German script. Flown, admired, respected. Luftwaffe Testpiloten 1945. An officer looked at the writing, then at Erich. "That you?" Erich nodded once. "Yes. You had guts. Most German pilots would have put a bullet in the engine just out of spite." "I didn't hate the plane," Erich said. "Just the war." The following weeks passed in a blur. Erich and Dieter were given limited access to restricted areas, supervised always, but treated with cautious respect. They were debriefed, interviewed, and asked to walk engineers through every detail: handling, acceleration, maneuverability, cockpit ergonomics, altitude behavior. They compared the Mustang to the Bf-109, the FW-190, even the Me-262. The Americans listened carefully. Not because they needed confirmation that their plane was good, they already knew that, but because hearing it from the mouths of their enemies made it undeniable. One afternoon, Erich was invited to sit in on a test flight. A young American pilot named Lieutenant Ray Gordon was taking up their Mustang for a high-altitude climb trial. Before climbing into the cockpit, he turned to Erich. "You nervous letting me fly your bird?" Erich smiled. "She's not mine anymore. She belongs to whoever respects her." Ray gave a small nod, then climbed in. The Merlin engine coughed, then roared to life. As the Mustang taxied toward the runway, Erich felt something stir in his chest again. Not envy, not pride, just peace. Dieter stood beside him, arms crossed. "We should have had machines like that from the beginning." Erich shook his head. "Even if we did, we never had the heart to use them right." The Mustang soared into the sky, wings tilting in the sunlight. A perfect silhouette, untouchable. For the first time since the war ended, Erich allowed himself to believe something strange, that maybe they hadn't betrayed Germany by flying that plane. Maybe they had just finally stopped lying to themselves. Maybe telling the truth had been its own kind of victory. 46. United States a year had passed since Erich Kessler and Dieter Braun stepped off the transport plane onto American soil. The war was now history, textbooks were being rewritten, and the world was moving on, fast. The two former Luftwaffe test pilots had slowly adjusted to a new kind of life, one without orders, without uniforms, and without borders. They had worked with American engineers at Wright Field for months, providing insights into not only the Mustang, but a wide array of German aircraft technology. What had begun as a military intelligence project had turned into something else, something almost collaborative. Despite their past, they were no longer seen as enemies. They were experts now, and in a strange way respected. But Erich knew it couldn't last forever. One morning, he was called into a private hangar where the Mustang was being prepped for its final test before being retired to a museum. Not scrapped, not forgotten, preserved. The same aircraft they had flown across war-torn Germany now stood, gleaming under bright lights, restored and polished with only one thing left untouched, the hand-painted words on the tail: flown. Admired, respected. Luftwaffe Testpiloten 1945. A technician approached Erich and handed him a flight suit. "Command says you should have the honor," the young man said. "One last flight." Erich stood there for a moment, silent, then nodded. He suited up in silence. Dieter stood by the wing, arms folded, watching as Erich climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a familiar clunk. The Merlin engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, like no time had passed at all. As the Mustang taxied down the long American runway, a small group of officers, engineers, and even a few veterans gathered along the edge, watching. The wheels lifted off. Erich pulled back gently on the stick, climbing into a clear blue sky that stretched wider than any he had ever known. No flak, no enemy fighters, no war, just freedom. At 25,000 feet he leveled off, flying steady. Below him, the American countryside rolled on endlessly. Green fields, small towns, roads without checkpoints. It was nothing like Europe. It was peaceful. Erich radioed back down. "She flies just like before," the reply crackled through the headset. "What do you see up there, Kessler?" Erich smiled faintly. "A sky that doesn't belong to anyone." After 20 minutes, he brought the Mustang down in a smooth, perfect landing. As he climbed out, the crowd clapped softly, respectful, not celebratory. They knew the story behind this plane. They knew who had flown it, who had once fought against them, and who had been honest enough to admit the truth. Dieter approached and handed him a cigarette. "Well?" he asked. Erich took a long drag, then looked at the plane. "She still reminds me," he said. "Of what?" "That we were never really flying for the Reich. We were flying for the sky." The Mustang was officially placed into the Smithsonian War Aviation Museum months later. The message on the tail was kept. No one painted over it. In fact, a small plaque was placed beneath it. This aircraft was flown by German test pilots during WW2, who left it behind not in defeat, but in respect. Erich and Dieter would go on to live quiet lives in the U.S., later becoming naturalized citizens. They never spoke at length about the war, but whenever someone asked about that plane, the captured Mustang, they would simply say, "That machine taught us the truth, not just about flying, about everything." And so the story ended not with gunfire or surrender, but with something far rarer in war: understanding, respect, and flight.